A little bit of fishing.
Crazy. I'm glad I got my sweater on.
You can tell it's an old fort with a brick.
1742.
Yeah,
That's the
looks like it's ready to fall down.
only Spanish watchtower in the continental United States, and one of only 2 fortifications made out of coquina. So, do I have any folks here who are already familiar with coquina? All right, got a couple. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with coquina, it is naturally occurring along the coast of Florida. It is tiny shells, sand pressure, thousands of years, until it solidifies into a solid mass. Now, Florida doesn't exactly have a lot of stones and rocks laying around, so when it came time to build mortar forts, the Spanish decided to use coquina that they quarried on Anastasia Island to build first the Castillo and then later on Fort Matanzas. So that's what the fort is made out of, but why is this fort here? As you were coming in this morning, you may notice a lot of condos along the water. Believe it or not, when Fort Matanzas was built, those condos were not here. I know waterways in Florida without condos, but it is true, folks. As far as the Spanish were concerned, this area was kind of the backwoods. Nothing out here much but salt marshes. So why build a fort out here? Well, that has to do with the waterway we were just on, the Matanzas River. If you were to hop on a boat and head north, you're going to end up in St. Augustine. So this is the back door into St. Augustine. If St. Augustine came under siege, what they could do is send someone in a boat all the way down the Matanzas River, out into the Atlantic, all the way down to Havana, the nearest major Spanish colony. Once there, they would alert the general, and governor, General's coming to this story later on. Alert the governor, and he would send ships, soldiers, and supplies back up. But how are you going to get those supplies into St. Augustine? Once again, the Matanzas River is your plan. So, the problem with this plan is it only works as long as nobody knows about the Matanzas River, as long as it remains their secret back road, so to speak. However, eventually the British do discover Matanzas River and in fact attempt to blockade it in 1740 during the siege, when General Oglethorpe, see I told you generals were going to come into this story, attempted to take St. Augustine. Now, the Spanish always knew it was a possibility that somebody would try and take advantage of the Matanzas River. So they had a series of wooden watchtowers along the river for quite a while. I would like to point out those watchtowers were very excellent at 2 things. One is watching. They could watch a ship come. They could watch a ship go. Not much they could do about it. The other thing, since they were wooden, they were super, super excellent at
burning down.
Yep, burning. There were several watchtowers that were burned. So, how do you solve this problem? Well, the Spanish decided that they are going to build a fortified watchtower in the entrance of the inlet, because this watchtower has something those wooden ones didn't, and that is cannons. Now, the geography of this area has changed a lot since Fort Matanzas was built. The island we are standing on was probably only about 2 acres in size, so much smaller. The entrance to the inlet much closer, only about a half a mile. So when those Spanish soldiers stood at the very top of this fort, they'd be able to see out into the ocean. Now, the range of the guns on this fort, accuracy, half a mile, range about 1.5 miles. Remember I mentioned that inlet entrance was only about a half a mile away? That means anybody entering the inlet was within accurate range of the fort, and any ships looking to blockade it out into the Atlantic were still in range of the guns. Not incredibly accurate, but who wants to hang around if you have cannonballs coming down on you? Another thing is this inlet is very shallow. No large warships would be able to enter it, only smaller vessels. And because of the size of it and the sandbars, they would not be able to maneuver broadside to bring most of their guns to bear. So let's review real quick. Any ship looking to enter the inlet is going to have to be doing it under accurate cannon fire, be a small ship, and not be able to maneuver. What this means is, according to all the records we have, is every single time Fort Matanzas fired its cannons on ships, they took a look at those odds and decided to nope on out of here without even returning fire. So this fort not only has a perfect record, but nobody even attempted to take it down. So it did see about 80 years of military service under the Spanish, then the British, then the Spanish again. The Spanish on average would have about 7 men out here. 1 officer who took that top quarters, and 6 enlisted men who shared the bottom room. Now, since they did have to keep a 24-hour watch, that meant that not everybody was having to be asleep at the same time, but we're still talking kind of tight quarters. They'd be out here for 30 days, keeping 24-hour watch, patrolling the area, doing things like rescuing shipwrecked sailors, making reports on any possible piracy they saw. Now, if something major happened, they could send somebody in a small boat back to St. Augustine to alert them. But a lot of the times what they would do is they would actually wait until the end of their 30 days to report anything that happened. Now, this was a British fort for roughly 20 years when Florida became a British colony. During that time, the British actually manned it larger. 18 men. There is one record that indicates maybe upwards of 30. And that's because when this was a British colony, there was this little thing called the American Revolution happening north of here. And the British wanted to make sure those pesky rebelling colonists didn't try to attack their forts down here in Florida. However, after the American Revolution, Florida once again became a Spanish colony, and the Spanish soldiers returned here. And that is up until 1821, when Florida became a U.S. territory, and Fort Matanzas became a U.S. military property. Now, when that happened, the U.S. military sent surveyors around to survey all their new forts and holdings, and Fort Matanzas was found lacking. They decided that it didn't serve them strategic and modern purposes, so they were not going to man it. So it never saw use as a U.S. military installation, though it remained the property of the U.S. military. So it sat abandoned for nearly 100 years. And during that time, there was a lot of structural damage to the fort. By the early 1900s, water was hitting the walls during high tide. We had collapse of the wall over there. It split in two, partial collapse of the tower. We had trees growing on the gun deck. Now, seeing as this is the only Spanish watchtower in the U.S., the military did start pushing for it to be preserved. Initially, there was a couple $1,000s given to bring in fill to try and protect it from the water. However, in 1924, it became a national monument and then given to the Park Service in 1933. And this is when restoration efforts started to really step up. Park Service did a number of things. We built a seawall, of which is top is right there. Yeah, you are standing on the seawall, sweetie. Awesome. Yeah, so as you can see, that seawall is now undergrounded for most of it. That is because we continue to bring fill in to raise it up. There's about 4 feet of the walls of the fort that is now underground in an effort to preserve it from high tides. Another thing we did is we had to rebuild sections of the fort. So if you were wondering if this is original, well, most of the coquina is original, just not where it was originally placed in some circumstances. We did not, however, restore the fort entirely to how it looked when the Spanish were here. One thing the Spanish would have done is covered it with plaster, painted a bright white. There was red in some spots. We're not entirely sure where, so we don't want to mess that up. But also, if we restored it, which period would we choose? Would we make it look like when the first Spanish period? What about when the British were here? Or when the Spanish returned? And we have markers that indicate their maintenance at that point may have not been so great. Additionally, that 100 years the fort was abandoned, that's part of the history of Fort Matanzas. Even the restoration period by the Park Service is part of the history. When you're going to go up there on the walls for the tower, you're going to see lots of tiny little holes. Those are not bullet holes. Some of those are just wear on the coquina. Some of them, though, may be nail holes from when the Park Service nailed scaffolding to the historic building to rebuild the tower. Don't worry, Park Service no longer nails scaffolding to historic buildings. We have learned. But that's part of the history of the fort, and we don't want to hide that. And if we replastered it, we would be hiding that. Additionally, there are sections of the walls you're going to see some graffiti on, mostly initials and names. Now, we can't date those. Some of them could be Spanish soldiers. It could be from the period the fort was abandoned. There's some that could even be from the people doing the restoration efforts, the masons out here. We're not sure. And if we replastered it, we'd be removing that bits of history. Now, having said that, please do not graffiti your national parks. But just by being here, you guys become part of the history of Fort Matanzas. In 100 years, when people are hopefully still able to visit the fort, they're going to be talking about those quaint old days when people came by ferry instead of across, their lovely hover bridge or whatever they're doing in 100 years. So with that in mind, making sure that the fort is here in 100 years for everybody to be able to still visit, we do ask that you went upstairs, do a couple of things, or not do a couple of things. One of them is to not sit or stand on any of the walls or the cannons. Just a reminder, if you're going up to the very top of the fort, watch your head and your elbows. When you're going up through that hole, it is tight, and like I said, easy to bump or scrape your head or shoulders
I'll go
on.
up that way.
There's a lot of uneven surfaces up there, so you want to watch your step. And those doorways are on the shorter side, so do watch your head when going through them. When we want to be back on the ship at about 10 after, I'll be giving everybody 10 and 5-minute warnings. And don't worry, haven't left anybody behind yet today. All right, folks, go ahead, head on up. I'll be joining in just a second.